And the next panel is focused on building police legitimacy with community stakeholders. And I'm going to invite the panelists up. So it's Captain Phillip Tingirides. Did I pronounce that right? He is the area commanding officer in Southeast Community Police Station with the LAPD. Phillip Atiba Goff, who is right there, associate professor at UCLA. Reverend Copeland, who is with the New Zion Baptist Church in Rockford and with the Rockford Area Violence Elimination Network. And David Kennedy from John Jay College, who's the professor and center director for crime prevention and control. And John Shane, right behind me, who's a professor also here at John Jay, is going to be moderating the panel. Please read their bios. They're very distinguished panel here. I'm just not going to go into it because of time reasons.
Good morning, everybody, and I'll get right to it. I know that we're running behind, and I certainly don't want to cut into anybody's lunch hour. When I was asked to do this, I began to conceptualize some ideas for police legitimacy, and I came up with 4 broad topics and then 5 questions that are very practical that I will pose to the panel. So the first thing I want to do is start off with a bit of a definition of police legitimacy. It's typically defined as the right of a police institution to be obeyed by citizens as legitimate legal authorities. And this entitlement is predicated on voluntary support and cooperation from the public who make judgments about police legitimacy and the manner in which they exercise their authority. Now, that's not from me. That is from a paper that Tom Tyler wrote in 2004, but I thought it eminently appropriate to start that way. And if this provides the social motivation for building legitimacy, then there are 4 things that I think we can look at. Number 1 is the police organization. If the police are to be voluntarily obeyed, what role do they play in cultivating their own legitimacy? The second thing is neighborhood collective efficacy that we call in social science, or building neighborhood cohesion. If we build neighborhood cohesion through improved police legitimacy, are the police in a better position to improve crime and disorder control? Number 3, crime, disorder, social division, and corruption in local communities. If those conditions exist, how do they affect police legitimacy? And more importantly, what about the larger, wider application of corruption in local governments and state governments, also at the federal level? And number 4, culture conflict. As society becomes more diverse and local governments become more bureaucratic and much more complex to operate, who should play a role in shaping police policy and practice? So with that, let me move to the questions that I've prepared for the panel. The first one is, who's responsible for promoting police legitimacy, the police or the community or some sort of partnership? And let me start by posing that question to the commander from LAPD. We'll talk about the organization.
Sure. Good morning. When I first went to Southeast Division was 2007, about the same time that AP started implementing their program. And when I got there, I was the 6th captain in 5 years. And so there was absolutely no stability in one of the most violent and poorest and areas of the city. And when I got there, about 2 or 3 times in the year or 2 beforehand, they'd had to lock down the gates of the station because of people coming to protest and in fear of them taking over the station. The guy that I took the station over from, he had only been there for 10 months, and as he handed me the keys to the station, if you will, he said, "You're one 25-year-old police officer away from a riot. Good luck to you. Bye." And what he said was very true. And I think if you ever take a look at a marriage, imagine 2 people married for 30 years, they hate each other. They lay in bed looking the other way, but they're responsible for growing a family. And that's kind of how I look at law enforcement and the community, because we are one. And if we're not one, we're working against each other, we're dysfunctional, and we can make no progress whatsoever. And so over the past 7 years, for the first 2 or 3, I really tried to look at how I could build a foundation to change the relationship, to give us, the police, legitimacy in that community. And in order to have legitimacy, you have to have trust and respect for each other. You have to feel like you're working towards a common goal together. And in the community I'm policing, most of the officers, very few of the officers, if any, come from that community. And so part of what I looked at over the next little while was bringing people in who came from that community, who grew up in that community. I had come from that community. I was born in that community, but it wasn't the same community that it was when I was there. It had changed dramatically. I needed to get the officers to understand, and these are police officers who are going to calls and seeing everybody at their absolute worst moment, worst time, and they were only seeing the bad guys, if you will. And so we started going into schools, and everybody has a community relations office. And they're really nice, they're really pretty, and you can say, we love the community because we have community relations officers. They're not the ones causing the conflict. The conflict comes from the officers, and we heard this yesterday over and over again, the ones who are going to the calls, the ones who are out at the scenes, who are having those interactions with the community. And so I needed to change the dynamics of those officers and how they saw and perceived the community. So we started a number of programs, and one of the most significant was going in and reading to kids in grammar schools. It did 2 things. It gave the officers the ability to see people in the community they don't normally see. It allowed them to see the youth and the kids in the community and realize that they're just like my kids. And it also put us in the schools building relationships with kids, and quite literally, when we first walked onto that school, they ran away screaming. And within a year or 2, they were running at us. So it changed that dynamic. And I don't know how much longer I got to go, but
Just a few minutes, we'll move on to question 2. Go right ahead.
so that's but 2 or 3 years of a number of different programs like that to start building that foundation. That's when we started the Community Safety Partnership that AP and Chief Beck brought in. And they asked me, what would you do if I gave you 30 cops to put in the 3 public housing developments? How would you use them? And we were at a point with the community where we had built trust with some of the community leaders, but the folks in the public housing developments who had seen the worst violence, who had seen the worst of the police and the community relationship. I'm lucky that I have 3 very large public housing developments that give me a structure, if you will, to focus in, because it's a lot harder when you have just open neighborhoods. So we went in with everybody thought, oh, we're going to have cops out there walking the beat, talking with folks. That's not what we saw. The direction that I gave was, I want you to go in and start programs. I want you to focus on the kids, because I knew in order to get to some of the folks that we had a really bad relationship with, we weren't going to be able to go directly to them, but everybody wants to see their kids do well. And if we can focus on the kids and start helping at that part of the society, we will get the adults to come in later. And so long story short, we ended up with programs that, from a football team that included kids from all 3 public housing developments that had been arch enemies against each other, but now rooting for their kids together, to tutoring programs, to scholarships. And some of it was funded by the Housing Authority, but a vast majority of it was people who weren't comfortable coming into Watts before, community-based organizations, who, when they saw what was going on, came in and jumped on the bandwagon. And we have a number of community-based organizations now who are helping us with a number of different programs. We have built relationships that have caused, one of the words I've only heard here once or twice, it has caused hope. It has caused relationships, and it has caused a very dynamic change in the culture of the police officers who work at the station and within the community.
Let me move to question number 2, because you said something at the end that I think is very important. And Professor Kennedy, I'd like to pose this to you to lead this discussion. What are the specific ways to increase legitimacy between police and communities? And I know that you're doing some terrific work all over the country with your ceasefire program and a number of other things.
Thanks. But first I need to apologize to my colleague here because I was laughing while he was talking. And what I was laughing about was the idea that we've actually gotten to a point in this work where somebody could say with a straight face, we're lucky to be working in Nickerson Gardens and Jordan Downs because that's easier. Anybody who's ever been in those places will have been laughing along with me, but he's right, right? So, I think the answer to that question actually touches on everything that we've been talking about. So here are the marks that I think we need to hit. We build trust by admitting that we have sinned, because we have, and we need to say so out loud. The beauty of this is that both sides are ready. I have never seen anything sweep through policing like these two ideas of legitimacy and implicit bias. These ideas have taken over the best minds in the field. People get it. There's a reason that they get it, and that reason, to my mind, is not just that they are good ideas and they're correct ideas. One cannot police a community that hates you and does not feel that you are treating them with justice. Everybody is biased. There's nothing we can do about it. And one of the things that's true for policing is that if you accept those things, it is an alternative to what you have been used to, which is people looking at you and saying, these are bad things and you're doing them deliberately because you're racist. I don't know, I was going to say any, and that's probably not right. I don't know many racist cops. You know, I've been doing this for 30 years, and I have seen nearly zero evidence of what we would think of as racism. You know, this is not Bull Connor we're talking about. Bad things happen. That's right. And the ideas of legitimacy and bias are giving the field a way of understanding and engaging with those bad things that do not require them to believe the stories that are being told about them. And they are embracing those things with help from a lot of people in this room. The community is ready, all right? So you heard from Mike and others that one can go to communities and say, you have a role in this too, right? The outsiders cannot set norms for your communities. Outsiders can't do all the work of violence prevention. This is not their problem. This is also your problem. And communities are embracing that. If you work in this world, you know that both the police and the communities are sick to death of this hostility and broken relationships and the old narratives. And Mike and others are giving them new ones, and they are ready to pick those up. You build trust by working together, right? And the landscape is now populated with clear examples of ways in which police and communities can work together every day in new and different and very effective ways. So Connie said yesterday, come to Los Angeles, we've figured out how to do this, we know how to do this. And I'm going to support her in that. I think that's right. And I'm going to go beyond that, which is to say, I think we know enough now about how to address these issues that we're here to talk about, that this issue is now ours to lose. If we're not in a better place on this in 5 to 10 years, it's because we haven't built on what we know how to do effectively enough. And whether it's what you're doing in Jordan Downs or the Watts Anti-Gang Task Force, Watts Gang Task Force, it's not even an anti-gang task force, right? It's a gang task force. Or what we figured out how to do with our framework or the various outreach workers here, there are, if not mature, there are well-developed, off-the-shelf ways in which communities and police who 18 months ago wouldn't even talk to each other are actually doing work together in real time, in real places, and the particulars may not translate and transfer, but the frameworks absolutely do. And you build trust by, and I think this is the Obama foreign policy line, right? Don't do stupid shit. And so much of what we have done, and I'm really going to aim this one at law enforcement. Right? We know about especially violent crime. Violent crime, and Mike said it already, violent crime is driven by 1% of the population, and even most of them are more trapped than they are evil. That means that if there is one phrase that should never ever be spoken in the English language again, it is zero tolerance, right? So much of what drives these flashpoints is heavy enforcement for small stuff. And as an old friend and colleague of George Kelling's, and many of us here are, broken windows, which is about disorder and civility, never meant arrest everybody for everything. It means deal with the issues that drive disorder and civility. And the debasement of that idea to arrest everybody for everything is a debasement. It's wrong in theory, it's wrong in practice, it creates endless amounts of friction. And if you look operationally at the Watts Gang Task Force and what you're doing and what we're doing and what Mike and Tenny are doing, it is all about direct engagement with the core people in ways that they don't even lead with law enforcement. They lead with various different kinds of engagement. And so I've probably used up more than my airtime, but
We're okay.
the question you asked has an answer to it. We know a good enough answer right now that we can move forward on this. And to go back to Connie's point yesterday, yes, we know how to do this. And nobody thinks it's good enough. But is it dramatically better than what we're doing now? Yeah.
Professor Goff, I'd like to have you weigh in on that question. Would you please, what are some specific ways that we can increase legitimacy between police and communities?
So I was thinking about how to bring something useful. That's always my goal whenever I'm going to open my mouth. A little bit to entertain and to draw attention to whatever tie I'm wearing, but a lot to be something useful. Thank you very much. My fashion consultant, Dolores Jones-Brown. And it seems as if most people in this room, when we talk about police legitimacy, know what we're talking about. Right? We're talking about the consent of the people to be governed, right, and to be protected by. And when we're talking about the biases that we have, it seems that most people in this room understand that there's biases beyond, I don't like blacks or Asians or whites. There's biases that reside in the mind that are human psychological universals, right, that we are born with the tendency and the vulnerabilities to have, and that need active policing, if you will, to prevent us from falling into the traps of our own minds. I don't think I have to work very hard to convince people of those things. But when we're talking about legitimacy and the taboo topic of race, there is more than just our own responsibilities. So I could talk about the things that have happened in Los Angeles, particularly in Watts. I can talk about the things that have happened in Boston, in High Point. I can talk about the things that are our individual success stories, right? And the individual responsibility that departments took. But I think what might be most useful in talking about the specific things that can be done is talking about the resistance that I often see from rank and file officers and from unions at the beginning of these conversations. Because you can say to officers, and as I, in fact, in one department that I've worked in, had to say, if you were engaged in use of force, you can't also use racial epithets. Can't do it. And if you need a policy for that, go ahead and write the policy. And the department I was working with wrote a policy, said you may not use racial epithets with use of force. And it turns out they had 2 people they had to suspend as a violation of that policy, right? That's straightforward, and there's not a lot of unions that are going to push back against that and say, well, no, we need our right to use racial epithets. I don't think we're going to get a lot of controversy there. Where you get pushed back is from what I'm going to refer to as 4 burdens, okay? You have the burden of history, the burden of policy, the burden of service, and the burden of the mind. So what I mean by that is, I walk into a union that is under siege, and the union leader or someone in the conversation will say, I didn't do those things. I wasn't even on the force then. That's not my fault. That's not my job. I'm here to keep them safe, and if they don't want me to, then we're going to have a problem. Okay. Now, that last statement is the soundbite that will get to television. That last statement is the thing that they will end up saying, right, in the skirmish line. The last thing is the thing that creates the problem. But what they really want to say is, how can you hold me accountable for something I literally didn't do? And it's not an unreasonable protest. It's a threatened response. It's a burden that they didn't earn. But policing as an institution, and sometimes that individual police department, has. Finding a way to get comfortable with that burden of history is incredibly important. And the good news is, from these anecdotes and from the stories from I mean, the names are already out there, so I won't repeat them. We do have a sense of how to do that. But David, I want to challenge. We know the specific programs, but how to deal with the specific burdens is, at this point, a lot of art in addition to a lot of science. Mm-hmm. Right? You need the charismatic leadership, but you need the good relationships. That's one of the burdens, and I think that when you've figured out the way to do that in your city, you're at least 1/4 of the way to buy into it. But it's not an unreasonable thing. I think communities need to understand from an individual officer's perspective, that's a lot of the resistance, and it's not an unreasonable resistance. I don't like getting held accountable for things I didn't do. Okay? And yet they've been done. And we need to take collective responsibility. The community needs to take responsibility for that, and the police department does. Finding a way to give that to individual officers is tremendously important. So what do I mean by the burden of policy? Burden of policy, I'll give you the example in Salt Lake City, which seems about as far from New York as possible, right? But they were one of the first departments to invite us in, Center for Policing Equity. And when I talked to Chris Burbank about it, I made a joke. I said, are you guys having a problem with the tan Mormons? What is the diversity problem in Salt Lake City? And he, having a good sense of humor, laughed at me. He said, no, we're about to be tasked with enforcing federal immigration policy. I said, oh, well, that's not funny at all. And he said, this is a policy, and if it passes, they're going to tell me I'm breaking the law if I don't engage in racial profiling. And it harkens back to that burden of history. I put them in this order for a particular reason. When the laws of this land were racist, it's law enforcement's job to enforce them. We've got laws in this land that are not necessarily explicitly racist, but they have the added benefit of doing racist things. And when police departments are tasked with doing that, well, in many ways, it's not the department's fault that we end up with things that are disparate, that the communities find objectionable, but most of the communities don't get that there's a distinction between the policies that are pushed on law enforcement and the habits and the behaviors of law enforcement per se. And making that clear, that I think we have a little bit more science than we've got art. We've got examples of police departments that have said, we don't want to do this, we think this will harm trust with the community, and communities and law enforcement together pushed back against laws. That's an incredibly strengthening thing for a community. And I think we can be looking for opportunities for law enforcement to engage in that. It can be risky, but unions, turns out here, can be a strength. Where a chief or a superintendent or a sheriff can't do that because of the ways in which their reporting structure sets up, unions can. They can say, we don't want to be tasked with doing things that hurt the communities we come from, the communities we need to protect. So that's that second burden of policy. Then you've got the burden of service. And what I mean by that is this. In San Jose and in Las Vegas Metro, we got asked to do something that very few other departments ended up doing, which was we compared the rates of stops when citizens called to the rates of stops that were officer initiated. You want to know where the biggest disparity was? Anybody want to guess? It's in citizen calls. Calls for service were a greater racial disparity in both San Jose and in Las Vegas. And when you factored that out, you ended up with about, in one department, about 5% of officers that were engaging in something that looked like bias on their own, and another about 12%. That's way less than what most people were saying in those communities. But again, the communities don't see that the community that they're with is responsible for most of their contact with law enforcement where it is. Now, there are communities where that's not the case due to certain policies. I see people shaking their heads, right? And I get that. But it is absolutely the case that no chief can say, hey, when someone calls and says, hey, I'm very nervous, there's somebody wearing, starter jackets, I'm showing my age, and bubble goose, at the end of the street, and I think you need to go and pick them up because they look suspicious. You can't have a department that says, well, I'm sure that's just implicit bias, and you're going to be okay. We're not sending anybody over. Go get a training, right? You get to stay in office for a week after that, and then you have to go. So regardless of the degree to which it's calls for service as opposed to individual responses, officer responses, there is a certain percentage of contact that is initiated not by the officer, but by other residents. And making that plain and accounting for the degree of disparity that is resultant from that tends to help with community trust. And in both Vegas and in San Jose, I was part of town hall meetings that happened afterwards, and it helped tremendously. Okay, and again, that's not on, I'm only talking about the part that's not on the officers. That's not to say there's not a huge amount that's on the department, but we should, in this room at least, find most of that unobjectionable and uncontroversial. And the last part, the burdens of the mind, that's the part where it helps to have a psychologist come in, not to talk about feelings and what your mother did to you, because I don't know and I don't care, but to talk about the ways in which our brains are set up to make us vulnerable to other people's biases. Stereotypes are other people's biases. And yet, if you're aware of them, under time pressure, they can influence your behavior, right? And that, again, we have a lot of science now. I can put you through a test, and you will come out feeling bad about yourself, okay? And that's not because I talked to you like your mama did, right? But you end up looking, hey, I got this bias here. And then I tell you 80% of America has some form of that same kind of bias, and you start to feel a little bit better. So if we identify those things that are not the individual officer or not the department's responsibility per se, but they do need to be somebody's responsibility, and you say it in that way, our experience has been, okay, we get that you're not saying it's our fault, but we want to take responsibility for that. We want to be the ones who are making it better. And when law enforcement leads with that, look, we weren't here, we weren't alive for, we didn't pass this, we have to respond to the call. Our brains are like your brains, but we have a responsibility and a duty to do better. And here's what we're going to do to address not only just the, hey, let's not shout racial epithets while we're hitting people, but also these 4 things that you might say are not on us, but we want to take on. That, I think, is an incredibly powerful set of steps for opening the table for the right people to come and sit down at it.
Reverend, let me pose the next question to you. Since you represent one of the most important informal social institutions that we have, which is the church, is increasing police legitimacy one way to bridge the divide between communities? And if it is, what role do you see the church playing as a stakeholder with other nonprofit groups to build police legitimacy?
Yes, it's definitely one way. The question sort of has something in it that I would like to push back on a little bit. I'm not sure that we're as much divided as we are disconnected. And I think that part of police legitimacy is reestablishing the covenant, reestablishing the partnership that already exists between public servants and the community, in which they serve. And speaking from not just the church, but just from the community side, I think the second part of your question was what role
As a stakeholder.
Should we play, and what role can we play?
Yes.
All those types of things. I think Pastor McBride spoke to this either this morning, or I heard somebody speaking about this idea of having translators. You need someone who's able to, it might have been the brother from the last panel, somebody who's not all sheep, not all shepherd. I believe he said he was a sheepdog. The idea being that we're disconnected in a lot of different ways, particularly on this issue of legitimacy, because there's a part of the community that really doesn't understand what actually takes place when we talk about criminal investigation, or when we talk about how things actually operate within a police department and as it relates to solving crime. because right now, most people get their cues. We don't do a good job in American education in teaching civics. So most people get their cues from what is supposed to happen from CSI, Law and Order, whatever. And so just to know that, for example, if something needs to go to the crime lab in Illinois, and we have a sort of, in Northern Illinois, a central crime lab, we don't have a crime lab, right in the department. It has to be sent off somewhere. So just to have somebody to be able to translate to the community that, hey, this is not like CSI, this is not going to be solved in 48 minutes, that it takes, X amount of time to get to the crime lab, they have to do this, that, and the other, so on and so forth, and come back. So I believe that community stakeholders can be great partners in helping to increase police legitimacy by, first of all, being knowledgeable enough to help to translate a lot of the legalese and a lot of the police procedure into ways that people can understand and that they can appreciate, because proper and due process really does not feel like due process if you don't know what the process is. And that speaks to this whole issue of legitimacy. I think Professor Tracy Mears talks a lot about that in terms of fairness, not only in how I'm being treated, but fairness in knowing that there is a standard that is applying equally to everyone. So I think that community stakeholders have that role to play. And I think also we have the role of holding our elected officials as well as those who serve us accountable. Part of what that question implies is policing legitimacy, one way to bridge the gap or bridge the divide between the community. Well, there should be no divide between me and the people whose livelihood depends upon my tax dollars. And if we approach this from the perspective that, first of all, that I need you as law enforcement officials to recognize that you're here to serve, and that you're here to serve me in particular because I'm the one who's footing the bill, and that you don't get to talk to me a certain kind of way and I shouldn't talk to you a certain kind of way. I believe that the community, particularly the faith community, can help to set that table by raising the tone and the tenor of the conversation to one of shared values. I think we talked about that yesterday, as opposed to sort of the narrative that is currently playing out, in the media as relates to this this binary sort of framework, as relates to good guys versus bad guys, as opposed to it's just us, and all we have is one another. So I think that in building that trust that David was talking about earlier, just this whole concept of translation, as well as helping to hold everybody accountable to what they agreed to, is the primary way that I think the faith community can help to move this process forward.
Excellent. In the interest of time, I'm just going to pose one more question to the panel, and I'll lead off by saying something that I experienced when I was in the Newark Police Department that dovetails on what the Reverend had said. And one of the things that we did was produce a Citizens Police Academy to bring all of our interested stakeholders to the table and give them a thorough understanding of how a police department works, because there's such a misconception, as you spoke about, from CSI to television shows to just rumor and innuendo about how the police operate, the things they can and can't do, the extent of what a police officer can do when they roll up to a corner and they see people standing there. Most people don't realize you just can't jump out of the car, slap everybody around, throw them up on the car, pat them down, and send them on their way. It doesn't work that way. And when you give them an education about how police practices actually work, they begin to say with a gentle nod, okay, until by the end of the course, after 14 weeks, they say, thank you for that. So a Citizens Police Academy is one way to build those stakeholders. So my question to the panel is, and if we can do this in just bullet form fashion because we're running short on time, what are some concrete examples that you can provide where you can increase police legitimacy, where these things have been successful, and what some of the obstacles were? Professor Kennedy, I'll start with you.
So I want to go back to this idea of translation, which I think is tremendously important. So 2 10 years ago now, we swallowed hard and went into a neighborhood in High Point, North Carolina, which had been an open-air drug market for decades. And the chief of police, who was a hard-bitten Texan career narcotics SWAT guy, stood up in front of a very angry community meeting and looked at them and said, "I'm sorry. We have not protected you. What we have been doing has not been working. We have treated you with disrespect. We have not uncommonly broken the law. And I apologize on behalf of my police department, and we would like to do better." And Phil's right that we don't have a lot of science on this. We certainly are still in the brave leader sector, but there is a certain pattern emerging. And the pattern is, whether you did it or not, you realize that this was your institution and you own it. And that room, which had come in locked and loaded, looked at him and said, "Well, okay." And then he said to them, "But you haven't been doing your part either, right? You've got drug dealers and gang members standing on the corner, and you don't say anything to them, so they think that you approve. And I know you don't, but they think you do." And that community said, "That's right, that's on us." And that single encounter transformed relationships in that place. It can be that rapid and that profound. And anybody who does mediation or victim services or has studied national reconciliation processes or any of those things that have this flavor will tell you that this is what these engagements are like.
In 2007, I talked about going to Southeast, and they had come and community had gotten very angry at a number of different incidents that had occurred and had come and they had to close down the station. And so right after I got there, we had a somewhat of a controversial shooting. And so one of the things that we did was to educate. We have a Citizens Police Academy, but we brought in folks who were there, who were angry, and we put them through some of our training, specifically the Force Option Simulator, which is the big screen where you have the gun and scenarios come up in front of you, and educated them on some of the things that we face, some of the things that officers see. Not to say it's okay that the controversial incidents happen, but to try and help get some understanding. It also helped with some of the transparency so that people could see what officers go through, what kind of training they get, and what kind of situations they face. So now move up 3 years later, in October of 2010, in Imperial Courts, 2 officers went in looking for some robbery suspects. They knew that that the suspect they were looking for had been armed in the past. They came across him, and the suspect, when the officers got out of the car, he grabs a young lady, puts her in front of him, and then when he thought it could best help his escape, threw her at the officers and took off running, and he was holding a gun in his hand. And as he turned to look and see where the officers were, whether he did it intentionally or not, he turned and the gun went around at this officer. The officer who was on the other side saw the gun coming at his officer and presumed that he was going to shoot at his partner, and he shot and hit the 17-year-old in the back, and it killed him. And it was very controversial because we had a number of people who were out there who saw that happen, and the different versions, stories that came out were starkly different and went everywhere from he had thrown the gun and they shot him when his hands were up to they put him on the ground, walked up and shot him in the back while he was laying on the ground. And those were eyewitnesses. The downside to that is that those stories, when told, became fact to other people who had heard but had not been there. And so people were very angry. And when I got to the scene, one of the first things I did was start getting in contact with community leaders, people, mainly intervention folks who I had built the relationships with, and the focus on that was to now take those relationships, take that legitimacy that we had built with that community, and use that to get some time so that we could do an investigation. Now, one of the things that police departments are infamous for when something like that happens is we will give you all the information you want about that poor young man who's on the ground, about how he was a bad guy and this record, that record. We did not villainize the young man in this case, because I understand that is somebody's child that's laying there. We were able to take that situation and get the time and then bring out as much information as we legally could to provide to the community at regular follow-up meetings. We ended up with no acts of violence as a result of it. We ended up actually enhancing the relationship between us and the community because we were transparent as much as we could be, and because we had and showed respect for the young man that was ultimately killed in that.
4 things, and I'll try to do it in bullet form because I want to hear what Professor Goff has to say. We had a very similar situation, August 24th, 2009. Mark Anthony Barmore, you can Google him, African-American male, 23 years old, was talking to a pastor in front of his church. The police had been looking for him to question him about something. He saw the police, ran into the church, into the basement where the daycare workers were working with some children. 2 officers came in after him, guns ablaze, shot him 4 times in the back in front of the children. Quite naturally, this was a flashpoint in our community. Rockford already a sort of racialized community anyway, but several things happened that I think speak to your question. First of all, the chief called in all of the clergy and the various community members that he had already previously established a relationship with. When he first got in, he came and tried to meet with everybody and said, listen, something's going to happen at some point where you're going to need to trust me, I'm going to need to trust you. So I want to get in early. He did that. So when this tragedy happened, he called us all in. He said, listen, I don't like how this happened. I need you to trust me that I'm going to do the right thing, but there's a process that we have to follow. I need you to trust me on that. The pastor of the church that this happened in, he said, Chief, something's going to have to be done with these officers, but I trust you, because he had had previous contact with him when there was not a crisis. Second thing he did, and this speaks to this issue of legitimacy, the community hired, the department, hired an independent review agency. I believe they came out of Oakland. They did this piece in Oakland back in 2003 when Oakland had some kind of consent decree. And they came and did an independent review, gave 33 recommendations. The police department implemented like 32 of them within 18 months without an independent outside agency making them do that. So that increased legitimacy, as well as putting together a task force from Cook County and the Illinois State Police to do an independent review, investigation of the police officers. So this whole concept of the police finding a way to get independent organizations to investigate when there's police or alleged police misconduct, I think is tremendously important. 2 last things to this issue of the Citizens Academy. So our department has instituted, and they've done it for a while now, these youth camps, where basically what we're trying to do is grow our own police department. That is to say, starting out early, we already have now within our high schools academies that are designed to move young people into law enforcement, but we try to start as early as possible. So we just had a police youth safety camp at our church for 4th graders about 3 weeks ago, where kids literally came out saying, I want to be a police officer. And it wasn't because that was what the goal was, it was just because of the positive interaction. final thing I will say, and this will be taking place this upcoming week, we've been pushing for a while, and now Chief is trying a pilot program. While citizens police academies are great, I think a greater piece is new recruits, that is new police recruits, need to be orientated by the community. So it's the flip side. Let us orientate you. Let us tell you how we want to be police. Let us show you, what's going on in our community, and let us be the ones that help you to see that you're not the experts on us. We are, but we're willing to partner with you.
Professor Goff, just 2 minutes, please. And then we'll go to questions.
So in terms of bullet points on things that have worked, I give the example of Las Vegas Metro. When we were brought in, it was to take a look at the culture of the department and to help them to analyze their data, because we are professional nerds. Shortly after we were brought in, there were a series of incidents that caused concern in the community, and so the local chapter of the ACLU wrote a letter to Department of Justice. Department of Justice began a process of investigation. What Las Vegas had asked us to do was said, we need the conversation starter. We need to know how bad is it, if there's a problem at all, and then what are the sets of things that we can be doing to diffuse whatever the issues might be. So we did our analyses in parallel with DOJ. DOJ then asked for an analysis through CNA. It's a naval, independent sort of naval statistical group. So they did all of that at the time the community was organizing a protest and a march towards the headquarters. We got done with our report. DOJ got done with their report, right? We were asked to hold our report until DOJ was completed. DOJ came with a set of recommendations. We came with a set of recommendations. Ours were longer. The department did every single one of our recommendations, and instead of having a protest at headquarters, they had a roundtable meeting with community leaders about how the community could help to implement those solutions. I think in law enforcement, we've got a lot of sticks, right? A lot of things to discipline a department, maybe not as many as we'd like sometimes, but there are a lot of things to say, hey, this isn't doing right, let's have more accountability. I'm all in favor of that. We don't have a lot of carrots. If departments want to do the right things and get out in front, they say, we might have an issue, we'd like to make sure we don't create an issue, right? And I think that this independent review, having a translator there, right, and then beginning with just the facts on the ground can be a tremendous advantage to making something like that happen. I have yet to see a DOJ investigation where they said, yeah, do that thing you were already doing, other than this. And so that's incredibly hopeful for me.
Excellent. Thank
Did
you,
I make
everybody.
my 2 minutes? Was I good?
Yeah, perfect. Couldn't ask for more. Let me throw it to the audience, please. Let's have some questions. Go right ahead.
I would like to ask the panelists, but I've heard from David about this already. How you think, here in New York City, we can build the legitimacy of the police department given the expressed philosophy of broken windows and the failure to, and I think that the definition of broken windows in New York City now is not what you say it is, which is just going after the disorder that breeds, just going after the minor offenses that breed disorder, but going after all minor offenses in what are defined as high crime neighborhoods. And I think that we in New York City have been hurt, I think, deeply by the killing of Eric Garner. And we're trying as advocates to move forward, not backward, as a result of that. So I'd like to hear, and I'd like to hear from, if it's appropriate, other police officials in the crowd about how we can move forward and whether, in fact, there's some definition of broken windows that would make me and community members feel better.
I think, one of the things with police officers is when you give them direction, you tell them to go do something, they're going to go do it. And so I think it's really important what message goes out when you give that direction. And Broken Windows started out with as more or less a community focus on problems to try and fix them, and it's evolved because of, and I've been asked 100 times since I've been there, how do you rate officers if it's not on arrests, if it's not on that kind of those kind of contacts? And I think earlier when it was asked, the public contacts is a great way to measure effectiveness. But the messaging that goes out is really important. And one of the strategies that we've used in public housing developments has been going out and educating. We are not going out and worried about some of the little stuff or some of the things that the community thinks are acceptable or in their opinion don't really want us enforcing. And smoking marijuana is one of them. That's one of the things that we've had a number of in the past force used over enforcing little things like smoking marijuana. And it's very hard for officers to go up and tell somebody, hey, you need to get rid of that, instead of going up and arresting them. And so how you approach it, the direction you give, has to start out with educating people as opposed to going directly to the arrests. And that's kind of the philosophy we've used towards that.
Question?
I'm I'm Gary McCarthy. I'm the police superintendent in Chicago, but I was also a New York City police officer for 25 years. I ran the CompStat process for 7 years here in New York City. From here, I went to Newark, New Jersey, and ran the Newark Police Department for 5 years. And I think that my statement is going to be actually an answer to the question that you posed a moment ago, because I really wanted to kind of add some fuel to the fire, not necessarily ask a question. And it's something that's dawned on me now that it dawned on me when I got to Newark, actually, that there was this is going to sound ironic, since I ran the CompStat process for 7 years. The CompStat process and a misunderstanding of the process results in overspecialization, which bars legitimacy. So, I mean, I can boil this down very quickly. We developed, under Bill Bratton 1, business management techniques to run policing, which was revolutionary. Preventing crime rather than reacting to crime. Empowering leaders, giving them the tools to go and address it. The method of delivery in most police departments across this country has shifted to overspecialization. When I got to Chicago, it's the clearest example that I've seen. There were 2 huge citywide task forces that did all the enforcement in Chicago. Those task forces were drawn from beat officers in the districts, which meant that the beat officers in the district simply responded to calls for service. And by the way, we handle way too many calls for service, things that we shouldn't be going to. Those officers do virtually no affirmative police work, simply reactive to a radio. The task forces went, and I'm going to say it, David, and invaded communities and produced unintended consequences. See, I'm maturing. And at the end of the day, the philosophy now in Chicago is that we can walk and chew gum. I disbanded the task forces, put the officers back in the beats in the districts, found the best and the brightest, created a career path for executives that goes through patrol districts, gave them the resources, and are now holding them accountable. That structure, and I'm using the word legitimacy for the purpose of this conversation, that structure will help produce legitimacy because you have the same officers on the same beat every single day, because every police officer in this room has been to countless community meetings, and the first question you get is, why are you stopping my children? You know who the bad guys are. Why don't you stop them? We want you to stop them. Well, in that structure, in that model of policing, we don't know who the bad guys are because we can't tell the 5 kids on the corner who are coming from basketball practice versus the 5 kids who are always on the other corner and you know they're up to no good.
Preeti, how are we doing on time?
I think we can do maybe one or two more questions.
Okay. Somebody want to add to that?
If I could just add something to what he just
Please.
said, not add something, but just point out something that I think is very profound about what he just said, and particularly in answer to her question. Very often, particularly in settings like this, we hear a lot of information, but we don't take the time to really drill down and think deeply about the philosophy. So we're looking for programs instead of actual ways of doing things. If you just focus on the and to his point, I think that's the idea. If we can understand what the principle is and stop trying to get a program, then you can make adjustments when you see that the thing is getting off track and it's not being used like it was originally designed to be used. That's all I wanted to say.
Please. Please, go right ahead. In the back, please.
Hi, I'm Barbara Raymond. I'm with the California Endowment. One of the groups that's not in the room with us today and often isn't in these conversations are the elected officials who also happen to be the bosses of police. So you have people that the public is voting for, mayors, city council members, et cetera, and who the police need to respond to because police are appointed. And I think that those folks actually have a dangerously low literacy level around what makes safety and what to do in these kinds of conversations. So it goes to these real extremes of, oh my God, the police are ruining everything, and now we have to swing to this one place, or okay, I'm scared of crime. You know, the only thing I can think about to do is what are my, how fast am I responding to calls? How many, people am I arresting, et cetera. So I'm wondering if there's a lever there with those folks that one need to build their understanding and capacity. And I know tons of you in this room have examples of having worked with those people in a way that is positive to both build their literacy, as I think of it, but also to effectuate some of these changes. So it's not just the community that has to push on the cops, and somebody mentioned earlier if the police would stand up and say, I think it was Tenny, stand up and actually say, yeah, we need more of the compassion and the prevention and these other things too, then people listen. And my last point would be that police with love, I say this with love, have done an excellent job at mystifying their profession to their bosses. So they, it's great because I can't question the chief, right? Like the chief's telling me what makes us safe, and I gotta go with that. So I think that there's a little bit of demystification through police academies, so citizen academies, and so forth. So can you all speak to some positive examples, perhaps, of that kind of work?
I think politicians are like anybody else. Some get it, some don't. Some are very proactive in holding you accountable, and some aren't. I have a current city councilman who oversees the area that I'm in and who is extremely involved, extremely proactive, and is not shy to call me on the carpet when he thinks something's wrong. And he gets, and I think this is really the key, because where legitimacy comes from and where I think we're making a difference in the relationship is because we have formed a true partnership. And I will tell you emphatically, the successes that we've had in Southeast LA where I work, it's not because of the police department. It's because of partnerships that include intervention, that include community-based organizations. The politicians that we have right now are very, very positive and working towards the same goals that we are. And so, it's the human element. Sometimes it's good and sometimes it's not. And right now, I'm very fortunate to have good, strong political support that is not evil-hearted, if you will.
Please, go right ahead.
So, Barbara, I am one with your aspiration. But if you look at how this stuff has been evolving, it has not come from elected officials down. The innovation here has really come from working level community and law enforcement partnerships that break new ground and then show political leadership that this is a way that things can be done. One of the really interesting changes in the landscape in the last couple of years is the kind of thing that PICO has been doing, and others in the sort of urban community organizing world who have sort of started with your idea and have been going to mayors and city councils and city managers. And Mike, I'm gonna caricature what you've been up to, but basically they've been saying, there is this stuff out there that works. These are our communities. This is what they want. And they've been getting the normal response, which is sort of, that's very interesting. We'll think about that. And Pico and others have been saying, we don't think you heard what we said, right? And part of the power of these partnerships for law enforcement is that communities can and are putting pressure on elected decision makers to do the right thing, which is policy, it's budget, it's operational issues. And these folks aren't playing around. And it is a very interesting political and education process.
All right, we have time for just 2 more questions. So Pretty has one here, and then we'll go right here, and then we'll wind it up.
I wanted to just respond quickly to the question from the civil liberties person. I think there's 2 thoughts I thought I would share. One, the discussion about how tactics like stop and frisk evolve. I think very often that they evolve in a crisis. The stop and frisk emerged when the homicide rate in New York City was through the roof. There were tactics involved in cities across the country designed specifically to reduce violence. But what happens over time is when those tactics are successful, the environment changed, the landscape changed, but the tactics don't change. And one of the questions I would have for the panel is, how do you identify when it's time to shift your tactics? The other comment I would make is a question about citizens police academies. I think it's actually a 2-way street that we never talk about, but it's worth looking at. We always talk about citizens police academies as if it changes the citizens' view of the police. But very often what happens in those classes is the officer's view of the community changes, because very often it is the only time when both the people sitting in the classroom and the officers instructing in the classroom actually set their roles aside and engage each other as human beings.
Southeast Station, where I work, covers about 9 square miles. I have about 375 officers that work out of that station. And if there's one thing I can't stand, it's being in the station. And so I am constantly out in the community. And when I'm out in the community, I'm going and visiting different community folks who have the ear of the community. And the purpose of that is to maintain relationship, but it's also to hear about things like that they can bring to my attention, and we can have a discussion about why we're doing something. And I'm open to, is it time to change? Or do I just need to give a better explanation? And so I think in having the relationships with the community, that means being out and communicating with them and hearing them and looking at whether or not it's time to make a change, whether it's a tactic that's outlived itself or whether it's just something that you don't know is going on because it's that officer that works in the middle of the night and you're not seeing him every day, but he needs attention.
Just to add one quick note to that, and basically to summarize, when the community understands and is literate in policing policy, police procedure, they will tell you when it's time to change tactics.
Last question, please.
Thank you. Thomas Ept, currently with the Kennedy School, but just most recently head of public safety for New York, and then before that with the Obama administration Justice Department. I just want to talk about New York for a second, and now that I'm out of my official position, speak candidly, which is that, not that I didn't speak candidly before, let me just correct that. But let me just say, I'm worried about the conversation in New York. I'm really worried about it. And here's why. I'm worried because the conversation that I hear in New York doesn't reflect the talent and sophistication and success that I see in New York's public safety, law enforcement, and community. And as people have said, that community reflects more than just the police. There are the Fortune Society, all the service providers, this vast, rich array of network. And the conversation right now is very all or nothing. Stop and frisk, yes or no? Broken windows, yes or no? Police, good or bad? We're better than that conversation. We are far more sophisticated, and we've come too far to devolve to that. And one of the things, and the people in this room are far more sophisticated. I think that we owe it to the city and to the state and to the country to make sure that those questions are framed in a more sophisticated way. Yesterday, and you heard that from Superintendent McCarthy, you heard it from Barney Malekian, you heard it from Reverend Copeland. It's not about yes, no, it's about how. And it's about acknowledging the very realistic concerns that you just voiced from the ACLU, but that the answer is very unlikely to be throw broken windows out or broken windows, no changes whatsoever. It's about having a more sophisticated discussion than that. And I just hope that we can make sure that the op-eds and the public statements and and those things start reflecting a little bit more of that nuance. Because if not, it's a very difficult policy environment for those politicians. You can have a good politician in a very difficult policy environment, and it makes their job harder. So just some things to think about.
Thank you. Let me stop now and thank Preeti for everything and Dr. Karen Terry for inviting me to chair this panel, but most importantly, for the distinguished experts that we have here. It's been a very enriching discussion. And to all of you for coming, thank you. Enjoy New York City, and let's have lunch. Thank you.